日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and today the topic is Japan and the Chinese tributary system. For thousands of years, China was the cultural center of Asia, and as the cultural center, it exported its culture and systems by way of a tributary system that various countries took part in to a greater or lesser extent. So I'll be talking to Dr. Travis Seifman about the tributary system itself and where Japan fit into it. Before we get started, a quick note. Please check out patreon.com/samuraiarchives to see how you can support the podcast and to take advantage of the bonus content. All right, let's get started.
So, the so-called tribute system or Sinocentric world order or Chinese world order was really pretty much the dominant system, sort of ideological system and also practical system for foreign relations in, let's say, traditional pre-modern East Asia. And that's a very broad thing to say. But
the system also goes back thousands of years too, doesn't it?
Right, yeah. So John Fairbank is sort of the main person who's articulated it as we understand it in modern scholarship. And so in his book, The Chinese World Order from 1968, he articulates, and he's not the only one, but there's sort of this idea that, it goes all the way back to the Han Dynasty, or maybe even earlier than the Han Dynasty. The kind of ideological core of this so-called tribute system is that the Emperor of China is the Son of Heaven, and he is the axis between heaven and earth, and all civilization and virtue, Confucian virtue, sort of emanates from him. And so, and not just sort of civilization, but it's this kind of civilizing force that by turning towards the emperor and sort of acknowledging his centrality and being willing to allow yourself to be civilized, that you will become civilized. You will. Anyway, it's about the emperor as the center of China more broadly, China as a force for civilizing everything around it. But kind of in what I think most, in the Ming and Qing period, so roughly 1400 to 1900-ish, which I would consider, which many people would consider to be kind of the high point of what we think of as the tribute system in its mature form. Basically what it is the Ming or Qing court receiving envoys from Ryukyu, Korea, plenty of places in Southeast Asia, on very rare occasions from Japan, receiving envoys who kowtow to the emperor and pay respects and acknowledge him as the center and source of all civilization, and pay him, bring him great gifts. And then in return, the emperor grants grants gifts upon those envoys, and also grants them formal authorization to engage in trade. And for centuries, this was the only way to do legal international trade with China. And so most scholars have focused on the trade aspect or the political aspect. It also has to do with China sort of in a conceptual kind of way incorporating these other kingdoms under its umbrella or into its sphere. So in a nutshell, that's what the tribute system is, in the Ming and Qing period, and we can talk more about that. But understanding that basic idea, we can kind of see how it stems, at least arguably, at least in Ming-Qing rhetoric and in Ming and Qing court's own rhetoric, it stems all the way back to the Han Dynasty or even earlier, more than 2,000 years ago, with how the imperial court at that time received not only foreign envoys but also provincial governors or sort of local regional rulers who also traveled to the capital or sent envoys to bow before the emperor, pay gifts, pay tribute, right? Swear their allegiance or whatever you want to call it, and receive gifts and also receive, imperial benevolence in return. And so it's a really kind of key element to not only foreign but also domestic political order, civilizational, cultural order that's centered on the Emperor of China.
So, over the centuries, what were the main countries involved in the tribute system? I've seen mention of like Vietnam, Thailand, and of course we have Japan and Korea. But what were the overall countries that were involved?
Yeah, so especially in the Ming and Qing periods, which is what I'm going to talk about because I don't know precisely what went on. Well, anyway, if we talk about the Han and Tang dynasties, much, much earlier, then it's different peoples, it's different countries. But in the Ming and Qing periods, Korea was always considered the most valuable or the most high-ranked tributary. And I believe they sent missions to Beijing either every year or every other year. And Ryukyu was second. It was Ryukyu, the Kingdom of Ryukyu or Okinawa was always very proud of being sort of second ranked after only Korea, and they sent embassies every 2 years. So those are really kind of the core. It's really just those two are kind of the core ones, and then Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, various Malaysian and Indonesian polities, Nepal, I think maybe Bhutan, sent embassies once every 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And as we move further from China, I'm not sure if we should say that strictly geographically, but anyway, the point is Korea, Ryukyu, and Vietnam are really the only major like Confucianized or sort of Sinicized kingdoms, right? Thailand and Laos and all these other a lot of other places in Southeast Asia are much more sort of Hinduized or Hindic kingdoms, and they don't use Chinese language, they don't use Confucian ideology, but they adopt those things only just for their tributary relations. But so those are kind of the core ones on the list. But it goes beyond that really the Ming and Qing courts pretty much didn't engage in foreign relations outside of this system of sort of ideology and practice. This was the way that things were done. This was the main way that people thought of foreign relations or diplomacy. This is the way that people thought of what the world order looked like at that time. And so when the Ming sent out, for a very short period, when the Ming sent out embassies under Zheng He in the early 1400s, like 1400 till 1410, something like that, and Zheng He famously went out on this massive treasure ship fleet and traveled as far as India, Kenya, I forget, maybe Madagascar, places like this, maybe parts of the Persian Gulf even. I'm not positive exactly. But he went out, all the way that far, and when he found princes or kings or chiefs or whatever you want to call them in places like Kenya, he also interacted with them in a kind of tributary fashion, expecting them to later on send envoys to Beijing to pay tribute, just like all these other kingdoms. And then in the I'll just say in the 18th century, when Britain first started sending sort of official embassies to China, of course the British notion of diplomacy, diplomatic embassies, diplomatic missions, British had a completely different conception about it, but the Qing received these British envoys also as tributary missions, expecting them, demanding of them that they behave in a certain way as if they were tributary also.
So I guess the big question right now, for me anyway, is what did these tributaries get out of the deal? What was the benefit to them? Was it opening of Chinese markets or legitimacy for their rulers, or what was it exactly?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, for a really long time, most of the 20th century, scholars, at least in English, maybe in Japanese too, but scholars, at least in English, focused very heavily on this question and on particularly like an economic side of it, with the idea that basically the argument that none of these countries could have possibly genuinely believed in their inferiority to China, in our modern conception of, a United Nations, a world of countries that are each equally sovereign to each other. It's very difficult for us to imagine that any country, any kingdom, would willingly acknowledge the superiority of another country, and bow and scrape and sort of accept that role. And so the the dominant argument for many, many years was that these kingdoms must have been sort of, grinning and bearing it, begrudgingly participating in the tribute system in order to get the economic benefit out of it. And certainly China's by far, the largest market and the largest producer of goods in the region, and to a certain extent, certainly one of the largest, economic powers in the world. And so it makes sense that, if you want to have trade, if you want to have access to Chinese goods, especially certain luxury goods like silks and porcelains and things like this, then you have to engage, you have to grin and bear it and deal with the tribute system. And for many, many centuries, China was in fact the only place in the world that produced porcelain. And I'm sure there were plenty of other goods that could mainly only get from China. But more recently, scholars have been starting to talk about, as you pointed out, the role of legitimacy, which I think is a huge one. Vietnam, Korea, a lot of these countries, but Ryukyu in particular, really used the tribute system as a source of legitimacy. If you pay tribute to the emperor in Beijing, then part of the relationship is that in return, the Ming or Qing court invests your kings and officially recognizes your kings as kings, recognizes them as legitimate. And so the Shou family, the Shou lineage within Ryukyu, used this as a source of legitimacy for themselves against any other family within Ryukyu trying to claim power, trying to become the royal lineage, by sort of saying, look, the Ming recognize us, so we're therefore the one and only correct, legitimate rulers. And in the 14th, 15th centuries in Ryukyu, it's much more complicated than that. There's a lot of vying to become recognized. But by the mid-16th century, it's much more settled, and this is the one family. It's the only family that's recognized by the Ming court, and it's the only family that has direct access to all the luxury goods that come out of that trade. And so legitimacy in that respect. And then also, when Ryukyu interacted with the Shimazu, when they interacted with the Tokugawa, again, they really emphasized, we are an independent kingdom, we are a civilized and refined and prosperous kingdom that is officially recognized by Beijing. And so, since Beijing officially recognizes us, you better treat us, nicely, or something to that effect. So those are definitely, so there's definitely benefits in that respect, I think, on both of those levels, both in terms of economics or commerce, and also in terms of legitimacy. But then I think a lot of people would also argue that it simply has to do, part of it is just also the fact that this is what people believed was the correct way to be at that time. This is just, it's a matter of propriety, it's a matter of performing your correct role within the cosmic order, or even within the earthly order. And so, I don't know, I apologize to go on too much for a second, but just to mention two more pieces of that. Luke Roberts talks in his book, Performing the Great Peace. He doesn't talk about the tribute system, but he talks about the sort of Tokugawa Bakuhan order, the relationship between the Tokugawa and the daimyo. And he sort of says people were just, they acknowledged that they were, superior to some and inferior to others, and they were enmeshed in this network of hierarchies, and they weren't necessarily, constantly begrudging it or resenting it, and they weren't necessarily vying to become the top of that hierarchy. They knew what their role was. They bowed to those people above them, and they got bowed to by the people below them, and that was just part of how the world was. So Liam Kelly, who's a professor at the University of Hawaii, in his book Beyond the Bronze Pillars, he talks about Vietnamese tributary envoys to Beijing in the Qing period. And he says if we take these Vietnamese envoys, these Vietnamese scholar officials at their word, they were honored and excited and interested to travel to China. They were excited to witness for themselves the source and center of all high Confucian civilization, and they didn't seem to resent it or begrudge it at all. So I find that really kind of compelling also, that just this idea that they weren't necessarily looking to get, of course they were benefiting, each kingdom was benefiting out of the system, but I think that we can take a certain kind of less realist or less cynical, less political science perspective on it, and acknowledge that within this Confucian ideology of the way that they understood the world, it was a perfectly normal and it was the right thing to do to pay respects to your superiors in the proper way. Another thing that's sort of worth mentioning, and we can get into it later if you want, kind of the controversies over the modern scholarship on the tribute system, but Fairbank and a lot of other people kind of really focused on the tribute system. The Chinese world order was the dominant mode of foreign relations. But in the last 30 years or so, a lot of scholars have really emphasized the fact that Ming and Qing relations with other peoples, Tibet, Mongolia, Xinjiang, all kinds of Central Asian peoples, and sort of, North Asian peoples, kind of different like nomadic groups to the north, Mongols and these kinds of things, Jurchens. Their relations with all of these people, and with Russia also, were not according to the tribute system, and were according to sort of different modes. So I don't know that much about the details of those relations, but I think it's worth mentioning that there's been sort of this challenge, this critique in the scholarship that the Ming court and especially the Qing court actually put on different faces and really engage in foreign relations in different ways depending on which partner they were facing.
I really get the impression that, despite China being, I guess you'd consider it an empire with an emperor, they weren't very imperialistic. So I was thinking normally when you're at the top of the heap, you're getting something from the tributaries aside from simply their tribute. You're also getting control of their manpower, possibly their lands. It's like a power you have power over them. But what was China getting out of the tributary system? Because you don't really get the impression that they were getting what you would traditionally think, an empire was getting out of their tributaries, like I said, like manpower and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, they weren't. That's a really big thing in sort of in world history. They were not imperialistic in the modern sense, right? In the modern sense of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Japanese Empire, seizing territory. Nor were they, imperialistic in the way of, let's say, the Roman Empire, which also, expanded and seized territory. So that's certainly a very stark thing in that China never tried to take over Korea or Ryukyu, fully in that way. They did take over Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang. They did expand. They did take over a lot of territory, and that's in that respect they are. They definitely can be seen as an empire, and that's a whole conversation unto itself. But you're right. In terms of their relations with Korea, with Ryukyu, with all these other countries, the Ming and Qing court, and certainly earlier as well, they always seemed content to have this slightly more, to have this kind of tributary relationship, and they were not actively using that land or taking that land. They were not gaining manpower out of it. It was not a direct sort of extractive or exploitative relationship like we consider imperialism to be in the modern world. But they did get the tribute that they're getting from these other countries is important. It is valuable. It often involves particular luxury goods or sort of local products. that are essential for the country. One thing I just happened to notice as I was preparing for this podcast was that as much territory as China had, and the Qing Empire was probably one of the largest land empires, they never really had a really viable source of sulfur. And so the amounts of sulfur that they got as tribute from Ryukyu was actually pretty vital for the Qing production of gunpowder. So that's, one thing. And yeah, so I think and they're getting ginseng from Korea, and they're getting other kind of particular goods that they need from all these different places. But I do think that there was also, just on a broad scale, there was to some degree, I think trade in general must have been valuable. Even as big as China is, still, any country needs to have import and export to have a good economy. I guess I don't know, a lot of countries talk about self-sufficiency. But anyway, I'm sure there was some, viable economic benefit to it. But you're right. It's a funny thing that maybe from a certain perspective, it's hard to kind of put your finger on it and really really accept that issues of kind of legitimacy or ritual performance of sovereignty, is in and of itself like enough of a benefit. But it did play that role. It did allow the emperor to seem imperial by having people constantly coming from the corners of the world to pay him respects, bowing down to him, and showing that they recognized him as the center and source of all civilization and so forth, was probably played a very important role in helping the emperor maintain control over China, maintain his position. I don't know. It was certainly seen, it was also seen as essential just from a Confucian point of view that if the emperor doesn't receive envoys, and he doesn't receive, if foreign envoys and domestic, regional governors and so forth don't bow to the emperor, and if the emperor doesn't receive those bows, and if the emperor doesn't extend his benevolence in return, then the whole societal order, the whole cosmic order is falling out of order. And that could cause all kinds of things. That could cause the sky to fall. So I think that's probably part of it, is that to whatever extent that the emperor himself or members of his court genuinely believed in these kind of cosmic ideas about Confucianism, if they believed in it, then they believed that it was essential to perform all of these rituals and perform these relationships. And and we have to remember that the emperor himself, even as powerful and as he was, he had obligations almost every single day. Even as he has hundreds of people bowing to him, he would turn around and face the opposite direction and bow towards heaven and make certain rituals and make certain sacrifices. And it seems to have been the case that many people at that time very genuinely believed that, if he didn't perform these rituals correctly, then the rain wouldn't fall and the crops wouldn't grow and so on and so forth. So, receiving tribute and extending benevolence in return was an essential part of that as well.
So basically, it sounds like what you're saying then is that China was just altruistically doing its Confucian duty by accepting tribute and bestowing culture, but for no other reason than just because that was that was their purpose. It sounds a little naive to, because there's always a reason behind these sorts of things.
Yeah, now that you put the word altruistic into it, it makes it feel especially weird. So obviously, an emperor, an empire is getting, they're being recognized as the superior authority, superior force, so, it reinforces that dynasty should be in charge, that emperor should be on the throne. So it's, it's very important for power in that respect. But, yeah, I don't know. It's a huge debate it's a big topic in world history. why were the Ming and Qing empires a different kind of empire? Why were they not reaching out and seizing territory and so forth? And I haven't read enough of those books, to know really what's being argued out there.
So did the countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia just have an opt-in, opt-out option where they can just be like, we want to be part of your tributary system, or we have no interest in your tributary system? How did that actually work?
I mean, I'm not aware. I don't think there was ever really a threat of if you choose not to pay tribute, then we're going to invade you. Although in the Vietnamese case, I think that may have happened. Maybe even in Korea, but not in Ryukyu because it was over the seas. But in any case, those countries that chose not to opt in, so to speak, simply didn't get to trade legally, and trade still. And Japan is the prime example of this, right? For the most part, and we can talk about the exceptions, but for the most part, the imperial court and the various shogunates in Japan did not engage in this tributary system. They refused to recognize the Chinese emperor as superior or as, central. They insisted on the Japanese emperor as being at least equal to the Chinese emperor, if not, greater. And they refused to engage. And so, for that reason, there was, from the Chinese point of view, almost all Sino-Japanese trade for hundreds of years was illegal. It was smuggling. And it still happened, but it raised all kinds of issues in terms of coastal defenses against the smugglers and different kinds of efforts made to reduce smuggling and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's not as if China ever invaded Japan. So I'm not sure if that quite gets at. I'm not sure if that's really kind of a solid enough answer, but there was a possibility of opting out, and Japan did opt out for the most part, for almost all of history. But, if you want access to the China trade, you need to accede to this system. And the fact that the Tokugawa shogunate, for example, the Tokugawa never had official relations with Beijing for the entire Edo period. But they managed to I shouldn't say the shogunate, but also kind of the Japanese economy more broadly, managed to survive, managed to flourish, because of relations with Korea and Ryukyu, and because of unofficial, which is basically illegal trade with Chinese merchants at Nagasaki. So all of the Chinese merchants that were coming in and out of Nagasaki for the entire Edo period were considered by Beijing to be smugglers, to be in violation of the law. But one can imagine that if this kind of trade was actually genuinely cut off, if the Qing had made an even greater effort to actually stop this smuggling, then Japan really would have had no choice but to engage in the tribute system if they wanted to trade with, the largest economy in the neighborhood.
So I'm thinking, should we step back for a second and kind of look at the overall history of Japan in the tributary system?
Yeah, let's take a moment and do that. Yeah. So I'm not really. I don't know if you happen to be familiar. Maybe you looked over the articles and you noticed something that I've forgotten, but I'm not really familiar with Japanese tribute in kind of the earliest periods. If we go back to sort of the earliest periods of Japanese history, there was some kind of relationship with, for example, we have this famous golden seal from the year 57, right, where I think it's Han Wudi, the emperor of the Han dynasty, has granted a golden seal to officially recognize the ruler of Na no Kuni, some polity within Japan, as being an official kingdom. And so presumably, even way back at that time, in the year 57 CE, the kingdom of Na was paying tribute in some fashion to China. And I'm not positive exactly all the ins and outs of whether the Yamato court, jumping ahead to like the Nara period, whether the Yamato court ever paid tribute to the Tang or like that. But jumping ahead to the Muromachi period is when it starts to get kind of heated up, I think, in a certain sense. And we have this example of, so from the Chinese point of view, they were engaging in some version of this tribute system for pretty much, I feel weird to use the phrase all of history, but some version of this tribute system for forever. But it's in the Ming Dynasty and then into the Qing that it really kind of coalesces and really kind of becomes the tribute system that we know and love, for lack of a better phrase. And it's in the very first year of the Ming Dynasty that the Hongwu Emperor, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, in 1369, so the year after he establishes the dynasty, the Hongwu Emperor sends a diplomatic mission to Kyushu, led by a guy named Yang Zai, and it contains a letter addressed to the King of Japan, basically expressing that there's been way too many pirate attacks all the time, and that the King of Japan should do something to reduce these pirates, these wako. And I'm not sure from what I'm reading here that whether or not there was a request for an actual tributary relationship, but the fact that he's calling Prince Kaneyoshi or Prince Kanenaga the King of Japan implies either a tributary relationship that's already established or a desire for one. And then Kaneyoshi has all the Ming envoys beheaded. So Hongwu sends another envoy, and eventually Kaneyoshi kind of gives in and agrees to play the role of king. So he sends an embassy back to China, paying tribute in the form of horses and some various other local products. And so they have, and then Kaneyoshi actually sends other 3 or 4 more missions, which provide horses, sulfur, weapons, and other items to the Ming court, and basically engages in tributary relationship, quote unquote, as it should be, right, in the normal fashion. This peters out in the 1380s. The Ming start to feel that Prince Kaneyoshi is being insincere, and so they cut him off. But do you know anything more about that? I don't actually remember that much about who Prince Kaneyoshi is to begin with, because it's never been my period of...
Well, I know that right after that, the last decade of the 14th century, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who was the shogun, got heavily involved with the Chinese envoys for a little while, because he seemed to have this big grand scheme where he was going to eventually replace the emperor, and he wanted the Chinese legitimacy to basically do that. But then he died before he could really get everything completely set. And then his son basically just his son and grandson reversed everything that he did. But he was heavily into that. I think he was the first shogun to really start trying to get that started up again. But then his son basically just put a stop to it after he died.
Yeah. I think he's might be more or less the only shogun who ever really engaged in it. So, I thought it was interesting. I noticed in Gregory Smitz's newest book, Maritime Ryukyu, he talks about this. This thing with Prince Kaneyoshi, just a little bit earlier in the 1380s, and I just hadn't known anything about it. So I thought it was kind of interesting that it's not just Yoshimitsu, but it's actually this other figure as well, who was a son of Emperor Go-Daigo, and he was the head of the Seiseifu, which is the sort of imperial court's main headquarters in Kyushu. And here we go. So Amino Yoshihiko, who's a very major medieval Japan historian, suggests that this tribute trade that Kaneyoshi engaged in sort of helps us to imagine that Kaneyoshi was trying to kind of establish himself as like a separate country, basically, to separate himself from the imperial court and from the Ashikaga shogunate. And he argues that Yoshimitsu, was displeased with that and rapidly took action to unseat Kaneyoshi. And so that might have been part of why Yoshimitsu got involved with getting himself represented as King of Japan.
That would make sense.
Which isn't to discount all the stuff that you said. I think that's, in terms of making himself more imperial himself. But so I guess that's kind of the narrative that we get is Kanayoshi is killed or he dies in 1383. Yoshimitsu gets officially recognized as king of Japan in 1402, and starts sending, proper embassies, proper tributary embassies. But after Yoshimitsu dies in 1408, Ashikaga Yoshimochi severs formal relations. So it's a very short-lived relationship, right?
If any listeners are interested in Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the article that really goes deep into this situation is Not for Lack of Will or Wile, Yoshimitsu's Failure to Supplant the Imperial Lineage by Imatani Akira and Kozo Yamamura, which is from the Journal of Japanese Studies from 1992.
Oh.
So I highly recommend that.
Interesting. Okay. I'm not aware of this. I would have to be interesting to read it. And I think, doesn't Conlin's book on, what's it called, Symbol and Sovereignty talk about this as well, or is he talking about a different period?
I'm not sure. I haven't read that one yet.
Oh, okay. I glanced through the book from Sovereign to Symbol. Yeah, I glanced through it. I don't really remember the ins and outs. Oh, he's talking about 14th century, so it's a bit earlier. Okay. Anyway, but I think it's related to sort of similar ideas of the Ashikaga shoguns trying to make themselves seem more like emperors. But so after Yoshimochi puts the kibosh on Yoshimitsu's ideas about engaging in the tribute trade, after that, I don't believe there's any official king of Japan, recognized by the Chinese after that, but there's still kind of a very on and off an active trade in which the shogunate is nevertheless recognized as like an official authorized trader, nevertheless. And so throughout the rest of the 15th and into the 16th centuries, there's, and you might know more about this than I do, but there's kind of on and off what they call the tally trade or the Kango Boeki, with various Zen temples as well as the Ouchi, maybe, I'm not sure about the Shimazu, but the Hosokawa, the Otomo, each kind of vying to be like the one recognized, the one authorized representative of the shogunate or of the imperial court, to be the one authorized sort of trader to go to China. And this works for a while, but then by the 1520s they start to actually really fight with one another. And sorry, one second. In 1523, representatives of the Ouchi and Hosokawa clans end up arriving in the port of Ningbo at the same time, 1523, and both of them arrive, and both of them represent themselves as being the one and only, authentic representatives of the shogun. And they have an actual fight. They have an actual samurai battle in the port of Ningbo. And so the Ming say, screw all of you, and basically kick the Japanese out entirely. And then, there's a little bit more detail than to say that they were just kicked out entirely, but basically from 1523 onwards, the Ming starts to kind of reduce its involvement, and then after 1557, they just outlaw entirely any kind of direct Chinese-Japanese trade, and that's not officially lifted until sometime in the Meiji period.
And that's when the smuggling and the piracy really kicks into overdrive, I think.
Yes. And I think also in part because, for reasons that I'm not actually all that clear on, the Ming have also banned direct trade in Southeast Asia. So Chinese merchants basically almost can't go anywhere without becoming smugglers, without being illegal. And so, the piracy and smuggling and whatever you want to call it just really kicks up into gear.
All right, that's it for part 1 of our discussion on Japan in the Chinese tributary system. We'll be back next month with part 2. But in the meantime, please check out patreon.com/Samurai Archives to help us out and to get your hands on the content that we have available over there. And while you're at it, how about a favorable review on whatever podcast platform you use to listen to this podcast? Whatever you might be able to do is greatly appreciated. So that's it. See you next time.